I'm really happy today to welcome Gregory Mankiw, economist. Before I introduce him, let me just start with some housekeeping. This conversation will last about 45 minutes. And after I introduce Professor Mankiw, we'll have some discussion about the implications of the pandemic for the economy, obviously a topic on everybody's mind. Then we'll move into some audience Q&A. And so if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom to send your question to Marguerite Joutz, Joutz. And then when we get to the Q&A point, she'll read the questions and Professor Mankiw will respond. The questions, of course, should be relevant to the topic of this conversation. So let me start with the introduction. So he is one of the most prominent macroeconomists of our time. Gregory Mankiw is currently the Robert M. Beren Professor of Economics at Harvard University. He studied economics at Princeton and MIT. And I should note the connection to Brown, which is that he has a child who graduated from Brown not that long ago. So we refer to him as a Brown parent. And great to have him as part of the community. So his research is incredibly wide-ranging, and I've been reading it for years. It includes work on price adjustment and consumer behavior, financial markets, monetary and fiscal policy, economic growth, among other things. And in addition to publishing really fantastic research in the most prestigious journals, he's been a wonderful teacher of economics. And many of you who are here today may know him as the person who wrote either your intermediate level textbook, macroeconomics, or the introductory textbook that you used when you first took economics called Principles of Economics. And both of these are fantastic books, and they have inspired generations of students to study economics and for many to go into the profession of economics. So really a great contribution. I want to also add something that's relevant, especially today's conversation, which is that Professor Mankiw has been very involved in policy in the US at high levels. So he served as an advisor to the Congressional Budget Office and the Federal Reserve Banks of Boston and New York. And from 2003 to 2005, he served as chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. So that's my introduction. And before we get into COVID, I just wanted to start with a little bit of background. And, you know, as I said before, generations of students learned Principles of Economics from your classic textbook of the same name. And how many years has it been since it was first published?
Oh, well, thank you for that very kind introduction.
Yeah.
The Principles of Economics book first came out in, I think, 1996.
Uh-huh.
And now it's in its ninth edition.
Ninth edition?
Yeah.
And are you currently working on a revision?
Well, the ninth edition of the Principles books just came out.
Okay.
The intermediate book, I'm working on the revision. And that's now in its 10th, and I'm starting to work on the 11th edition of that.
Wow. So let me just ask you a question. Why did you decide to write maybe either or both of these books? And was it inspired by your teaching? Were you dissatisfied with the other books that were out there on the market? How did you come to this?
Well, I started actually at the intermediate level. As soon as I got promoted to full professor at Harvard, the chairman asked me to teach the intermediate macro course, and then they needed somebody matrix.
That's like the reward for getting tenure?
Yeah, exactly. I'd take over this sort of big intermediate course. And it was fun. I enjoyed doing it. But when I looked around at the books that were out there, none of them quite satisfied me. And I had this sense that, oh, if I'm already going to write lecture notes, how much more work could it be to write a book? And so I signed up to write one. It turns out it's a lot more work to write a book, actually, than lecture notes. I didn't particularly appreciate that, but I enjoyed doing it. And so that book then came out around 91. And then when that book came out and started selling well, publishers approached me about writing the introductory book. And they said, some of the changes you've done at the intermediate level, can you make similar changes at the principles level? And I thought that was a great challenge, especially since it's such an important course for so many people. You know, there's 1 million students a year take.
It's the course that makes you decide to go into economics or not. Right?
Exactly. So that's what did. When I went to college, I had no idea I was going to major in economics. And I was taking the introductory courses that really changed the path. I remember reading Paul Samuelson's famous text back in 1977. and it was very inspirational. So it was a great challenge to try to do something similar to what Paul had done.
Yeah. So professional economists know you as much more than somebody who writes textbooks.
I hope so.
And you've done groundbreaking research in a range of areas. You told me before we started this conversation that you're on sabbatical this year, a slightly interrupted sabbatical. But what are you working on now? What are you most interested in?
Well, one of my more recent papers was on history of thought. Actually, I decided to go back and look at the early teaching of economics. Actually, one of the first books written by a Harvard professor on economics was a book by a guy named Francis Bowen, who wrote a book about introductory economics in 1856. And so I went back and when I was interested in what have we learned since 1856, what commonalities do we see since 1856. Interestingly, by the way, one of the motivations of Francis Bowen was because one of the other books that was a bestseller at the time was by Francis Wayland, who was one of your predecessors at Brown University.
Exactly.
And he had one of the best-selling textbooks. And so Francis Bowen at Harvard came to compete with Francis Wayland's book.
That's interesting.
And Francis Bowen thought Francis Wayland was much too sympathetic to free trade. Francis Bowen thought that we really need to protect American manufacturing with tariffs. And that was one of the motivations for the Harvard professor. I think actually your guy was right on the topic of free trade. Our guy was wrong, but it's kind of interesting to see that history of thought develop back in the mid-19th century.
That's great. Okay, so look, let's turn to the current situation. So I think we all know the numbers. Unemployment is skyrocketing. I mean, really, really taking off. Second quarter GDP projections are pretty abysmal. The latest I've seen is on the order of 8 to 15% declines. The Dow was up 7% yesterday. I haven't checked to see what's going on today. But even with those gains, all of the gains from the last 3 years overall in the market are basically gone at this point. So, for an economist, this is really a challenging thing to think about. When we think about the kind of shocks that can derail economies, we think about supply shocks and demand shocks and financial market failures. We don't normally think of global pandemics. And, just to get this started, how do you think through this? I've heard a lot of people say, is this like 2008? And at some level, it can't be anything like 2008, but maybe in other ways it is. So how are you just approaching this from a conceptual point of view?
Well, in terms of the employment and production drops, it's probably going to be even deeper and steeper than 2008. I mean, the last month's decline in the employment population ratio was the single biggest monthly decline since this data was started being collected in 1948. And that was collected on March 12th. The last 2 weeks of March were even worse. So we know that record is going to be broken next month. We see even a steeper decline in employment. So this is a very, very fast decline in employment, and it's probably going to look deeper than 2008. So that's sort of the bad news. The good news is that if you look at it, the breakdown of sort of people losing their jobs, very little of the unemployment is due to permanent job losses. It's all due to temporary layoffs. And that at least gives a glimmer of hope that if the pandemic ends within a few months, people can go back to their jobs. They're not being released from their employment permanently, they're just being furloughed, and they could perhaps come back quickly. All that's going to depend on what happens to the pandemic. So in some sense, it's the microbiologists are on the lead here, not the economists. And so what happens in their world is going to determine what happens in our world.
Right. So what would make you concerned about the possibility of a relatively quick recovery? Because what you said is the best case scenario.
Yes, absolutely.
Pandemic ends quickly, people could just go back, they're furloughed now, they go back to work. What would would it be bankruptcies? Would it be, what would make you concerned?
Well, yes, I think the question is whether businesses are going to end up shuttering that in some sense shouldn't shutter because they're long-term viable. So you can imagine a sort of a small restaurant who basically runs out of their liquidity, and as a result shuts their doors, even though when the pandemic is over, they they could open up again. So that would make me nervous. The other possibility is that this obviously this current mitigation is going to will stop at some point, but it could be that going on longer periods of time, we will decide certain activities aren't advisable. So one can imagine that even after the pandemic is over, people will feel more reluctant to go to restaurants, to go to concerts, to go to baseball games. And so there may be a longer term change in behavior even after the sort of hump is over, that makes people not want to spend money. And that could well cause us to have a longer term recession.
Right. Where were you before this hit? Were you, I mean, a lot of people were saying, you know, the boom has to come to an end. We're about to enter a recession. What were your views even before the crisis?
No, before the pandemic, I was reasonably optimistic about the economy. There's pretty clear evidence that expansions don't die of old age. So there's no sort of sense in which just because expansion's gone on for a long time, and this was the longest on record before this pandemic hit, just because it had been a long time, there's no reason that a recession had become inevitable. Mm-hmm. So I didn't, before this pandemic hit, I did not see any economic downturn. Maybe a slow rising unemployment rate. That's why the Fed was tightening a little bit early on, because they were kind of worried that expansion going on to the extent that it might become inflationary. Mm-hmm. So I could imagine a slowdown, but I did not see a recession. The pandemic, I think, is really the proximate cause, and really the only cause. This is only very different about this recession compared to other recessions, by the way. Most recessions we view as things we try to get out of as quickly as possible. Right? Yeah. When we have high unemployment in a recession, we want to get people to go back to work as fast as possible, and that's the goal of policy. Here, we don't want people to go back to work quickly. No. We want them to stay at home. So this is one of the first recessions that's optimal, not in the sense of desirable, but in the sense of the best we can do under the circumstances. Right. And so maybe sort of this small decline, well, not small, it's a big decline, but perhaps temporary decline might have a rapid rebound if once we decide, oh, now it's safe for people to go back to work. Right, right. But we have to get to that point. We have to get to that point. And that's going to depend on how long the pandemic goes on, how quickly testing is developed. I mean, Paul Romer, the Nobel Prize winner from a couple of years ago, has emphasized what we really need is a whole infrastructure for more rapid testing. So you can imagine if every American gets tested every few weeks, in one of these sort of 4-hour tests, then you know you don't have it, then you know you can go out and back to work, and then we can easily quarantine those who do have it. I mean, the fact that many people have this are asymptomatic is a real problem because it's very hard to quarantine people. But if we had testing that could sort of catch people who have this even before they're symptomatic, that could become extremely valuable. And we just don't know how quickly those tests will develop. I mean, the flip side of a lot of people being asymptomatic is it means a lot of people have recovered and are presumably have some immunity to the illness. Yes. And we don't even know about that, right? That's right. That's right. So it could have been there's lots of people who've already had this. They didn't know they had it, and they recovered, and now they're fine. And they're hunkering down in their houses unnecessarily. So-called serology tests, the tests for antibodies, that would also be extremely valuable in terms of determining people's behavior. Yeah. The fact that we have basically almost no testing now. I mean, very little testing is very low. A lot of people I know who have been tested have to wait a week for the results. Mm-hmm. That really does not an effective testing procedure. I know they've developed tests now, but my daughter's a medical student, and she said at the hospital they have now a test. They can get back results in 4 hours. Well, if those kind of 4-hour tests can become widely available, it's going to completely change the nature of social distancing because different people can behave differently depending on their status. Right, right, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about policy and fiscal policy first. So we had the $2.1 trillion Caras Act that was recently passed and signed into law, and I've heard that some of that money is already getting out there, which is good. And it includes a number of major provisions for corporations and small business loans and household payments and unemployment insurance and so on and so on. And, it's always easy to critique legislation. And I guess I'm asking you to do it, which is if you could have waved a magic wand and come out with the right package of fiscal policies, what do you think in this bill is great? What do you think maybe was a missed opportunity or missed the mark? Yeah, Harvard has recently gone for the spring semester to entirely pass-fail grading on the grounds it's unfair to grade people in an emergency on an A to F scale. And so maybe the same criteria should apply to grading legislation. And I think they definitely get a passing grade.
Okay.
Okay, so it's very hard to write huge bills quickly and get everything exactly right. So I think Congress really did step up, and by and large, they did a good job here. And I think that's sort of the first bottom line. I think there's certain parts of it that look imperfect. I think, for example, expansion of unemployment insurance was terrific. That was really important. The unemployment insurance system tends to be fairly bureaucratic, so their ability to change the parameters of unemployment insurance was fairly limited. As a result, some workers are now getting more than 100% replacement rates.
Oh.
They're actually better off unemployed than they were before when they were employed. That's probably not an optimal system, but they couldn't change the parameters like replacement rates too easily, given the way the computer systems are set up. So they're giving $600 to everybody. For some people, it's too much. For some people, it's too little.
Right.
That's just because the systems are clunky. The Paycheck Protection Program, which is trying to bail out small businesses, are basically forgivable loans to small businesses. I think that was very well intentioned. I think it's going to have a variety of imperfections. We're going to find that some businesses are going to be afraid to borrow and pay out the money to workers because they're afraid that the loans might not be forgiven. And the last thing you want to do is sort of take out $10 million, pay it out to workers, and then run into some bureaucratic snafu, you don't get your loan forgiven. And there'll be other businesses that don't really need the money who say, hell, this is an opportunity to get a loan that might be forgiven. Might as well borrow and see what happens. I might get a windfall, I might not. Worst comes to worst, I just pay it back. So I think that, and the Small Business Administration is not really in a good position to oversee this. It's fairly bureaucratic. That's why they've delegated a lot of this to the banks. Some of the banks are saying they're going to favor their long-established customers as opposed to new customers. It's going to be it's an imperfect system, but perfection is not possible when you're doing things this fast. So I think by and large, they've done a pretty good job.
So just a couple follow-up questions. So, you know, the unemployment insurance, like you say, it's very generous, and that's great. But are you worried at all about perverse incentives for employers? So, you know, I know at Brown, we're working as hard as we can to avoid laying off or furloughing any of our employees. But if you tell me that my employees can actually get more if they're furloughed or laid off than what they're being paid now, how am I supposed to respond to that?
Yes, and especially the low-wage employees, janitors, for example, they will get more under unemployment insurance, assuming they're eligible. I'm sure Brown pays their unemployment insurance as they should.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of your employees come to you and say, "Please lay me off for a while."
Yeah,
they'll do better off there. And so you're right. It's an imperfect fix to a very bureaucratic system.
Right. What do you think about the provision that's giving kind of lump sum payments to households? It's based on income, but it's based on their income from last year, the year before.
Yeah, I think that's a good start. It's not that much money. It's only $1,200 per person. So it's a small amount of money. I think it was useful to do. It's probably going to take too long to go out just because writing checks to 300 million people just takes time.
Yeah.
But I think it was a useful thing to do. I think if this thing goes on for a long time, we may have to do something similar, but better targeted again. I have a particular proposal that something maybe it's too clever by half to actually be enacted. But basically what it is, it's to give lots of people much bigger checks than they have now, but then to target it ex post. That is, if you're a person whose income does not fall this year, then this check that you're getting now is just a loan. You'll basically repay it back in the form of higher taxes spread over the next few years. Yeah. But if your income falls down a lot this year, then this check becomes a grant. Oh. And so we send out a lot of checks now, but whether it's a grant or just a loan will depend on what your particular circumstances are. But we don't figure that out now. You figure that out after the fact. So it's based on your 2020 income, not your 2019 income.
So is that something that anybody's really been considering? It is.
There's other ideas floating around. I got somebody in Canada said that Canada's thinking something similar. I don't think it's not shown up in legislation yet. The one way to think about it is a little bit like Andrew Yang's universal basic income, but to
Yeah,
only be provided for people who need it during the crisis. And that's not a permanent thing, which is a much bigger deal. But this is
right.
a temporary universal basic income, especially for people who are suffering income declines during this period. So I think something like that's doable. That'll be necessary if this thing is not a 2-month shutdown, but it ends up being a 4 or 6-month shutdown.
Hmm. So when you think about these policies, I mean, these are basically income support policies.
Right.
And, one reason to favor them is that it's just the right thing to do. We can't let people drop off the deep end because of the crisis. But I mean, do you also think of these as being really important for getting the economy up and running again?
Well, I mean, this is often referred to as a stimulus. Usually
Yeah,
we get tax cuts during recessions. We do it in order to increase spending, to get people back to work. In this case, I don't think stimulus is the main motivation. I think it's more disaster relief
yeah,
because we want people to stay at home. We're not trying to get people back to work. Um, one question becomes, once we want people to go back to work, will there be sufficient demand? And this will help people's bank accounts from not being depleted so that when people can go back to work, there will then be demand. So we will provide stimulus, but not for stimulus now, for stimulus maybe for a few months from now when the economy is trying to recover. So there will be some stimulus aspect to it, but I think fundamentally, this is what disaster relief, or what some economists call
yeah.
social insurance, that's the main motivation here. And so stimulus is kind of a weird name to apply in this particular circumstance.
Do you think that when we start to come out of this and people are going back to work, we may need some more stimulus? Are you worried about too much debt or?
We're gonna have to worry about the government debt at some point.
Yeah,
Now is not the time to worry about it. I mean, I think that standard economics says that in times of crises like deep recessions, wars, pandemics, now is the third one to add, is not the time to worry about government debt. And so I think increasing the government debt is the right thing to do. Once we come out of this, yes, we're gonna have to figure out how to repay that debt, presumably over a period of many, many years, not immediately.
right. So let's shift a little bit to monetary policy, which you've also done a lot of work on. And what do you think the biggest risk of this crisis is for financial markets, the banking sector? Are you at all worried about the stability of that infrastructure?
Well, I would if I didn't have confidence in what the Federal Reserve is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I do. I think they've actually done a very good job. They've been very activist. Um, the Fed's main job is to set monetary policy sort of quarter to quarter, right, raising and lowering interest rates. But in times of crisis, their main job switches to becoming lender of last resort.
Mm-hmm.
And they're being very active at acting as lender of last resort. The new legislation has given them more powers
Mm-hmm.
to act as lender of last resort, acting more with the Treasury. And so now they're worried not only about financial institutions like banks, they're also going to be involved in providing credit to non-financial corporations, which involves some set of risks, but it's the right thing to do. It's in the sense to make sure the financial system continues to work. Now, the risks are that the Fed is not there to evaluate non-financial corporations. So they're not really set up to decide whether this company or that company deserves a loan under what terms. They don't really have the staff to do that, but they're going to presumably be working with banks and the Treasury to try to figure that out. There'll be mistakes along the way for sure, but I mean they have an expanded scope, and they're trying to make sure that the financial system keeps working, and that's the right thing to do.
Right. So the Boston Fed is now running a money market mutual fund liquidity facility, and I don't know. I mean, maybe you could just tell people a little bit about why that was necessary.
Well, yeah, money market funds typically take money on a short-term basis, on a demand deposit basis, and then they invest in things like commercial paper. There's always been a fear, even before this happened during 2008, that there would be a run on money market funds. And if people started taking their money out of the money market funds, the commercial paper market would dry up. And therefore, all the companies that rely on issuing commercial paper for funding a variety of short-term liquidity needs wouldn't be able to fund that. And that could cause all sorts of problems and companies not being able to get working capital. And that's exactly the kind of lender of last resort thing that the Federal Reserve System is well set up to handle. I mean, a money market mutual fund is sometimes called a shadow bank. It's not really a bank, and it's subject to all sorts of bank regulations, but a lot of the things it does is taking money in demand deposits, make loans to businesses, is a bank-like activity. And the distinction between banks and shadow banks is often fuzzy. And so over time, the Fed has realized, oh, well, if we're going to regulate banking and be a lender of last resort to that, maybe we should be a lender of last resort to shadow banks.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what they're doing here.
How much do you think that they learned from the 2008 crisis? I mean, I think about the initial response or maybe lack of response to Lehman. And I mean, if we hadn't gone through that crisis, do you think they would be as willing to be as aggressive now as they maybe weren't then, at least initially?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot. Yes, been a lot of look back at that. I mean, there's a great book by an economist named Larry Ball at Johns Hopkins called The Fed and Lehman Brothers. He makes a pretty compelling case that the Fed blew it in letting Lehman go down.
Yeah.
The Fed sort of learned that lesson relatively quickly. So within a few months, maybe even weeks, they changed tune when other financial institutions. So I think they recognize now how important their role of lender of last resort is. So I think they have to learn something. In some ways, though, that's very different. I mean, that was a situation in which the problem started in the financial system and then spread over to the rest of the economy. Here, the problem is starting someplace completely else. There wasn't any problem in the financial system until the pandemic. And then people are worried that the pandemic is going to affect the financial system.
Right.
In some ways, though, the situation is a little easier now. A lot of people were angry at banks back in 2008 and were very, very critical of the Fed and the so-called bailouts of the banks. I actually think that the Fed's critics were unfair because these bailouts of the banks didn't really hand taxpayer money to the banks. They were really loans that got paid back with interest, and the taxpayer actually made money from most of the financial bailouts. So I think the Fed did the right thing, even though they got a lot of critics. Here, there's not quite as much criticism of the lending because people realize there's nobody at blame. There's no evil bankers to blame. It's the virus,
right?
And they're not bailing out the virus. So I think the Fed's going to have a little less criticism than it did last time around.
And maybe that's part of the reason why this has been able to move quickly, as quickly through I mean, I've never seen Congress pass something so quickly in years, right?
Yes. Yes. No, I think it's been a miracle in making because we're not demonizing bankers like we were then. Instead, we realize we're a common enemy.
Yeah.
The virus, and sometimes we're all in this together. And so it's in that sense, it brings the community together in a way that the last crisis was perhaps more divisive.
Mm-hmm. So let's just talk a little bit before we go to Q&A. I'm checking time. Oh, we have time. To say a little bit about the global economy. And, you know, here we have a virus, a pandemic, but it's hitting different spots around the world at different times. It's disrupting international supply chains and trade. How important will it be to reopen sort of the global economy to getting the U.S. economy back on track?
Well, I'm a big fan of international trade. And fortunately, I don't think there's any reason to think this should impede international trade because goods can go across borders without transferring the virus, as far as we know. So I'm not actually worried about that longer term. When I look at the international picture, the thing that scares me the most are the emerging markets. Because if you're an emerging markets country, you don't really have the fiscal capacity to do what we're doing, which is to sort of expand government debt, provide social safety net for people, while people shelter in place. So it's much harder if you're a poor country because people aren't going to buy. People will buy as much U.S. government debt as we'll issue, at least within reason. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we're ever close to our fiscal capacity. You never know, but so far we don't look like we're close to our fiscal capacity. A lot of the emerging markets are already past the fiscal capacity. They already pay high interest rates. If they start increasing their debt even more to provide relief programs, that's going to be very hard. So they're probably going to be hit much harder economically. People are going to feel like they can shelter in place. They'll feel like they need the cash income, so they won't be social distancing. The viruses may spread more quickly. So I think actually, if you look at the countries that are most likely to be hit very hard by this, both from a health standpoint and an economic standpoint, my guess is it's going to be the emerging markets.
So, are there any countries in particular that you worry about more?
Well, I don't follow that close enough to have particular countries in mind. Yeah. But you know, in general, the past decade has been one where a lot of countries have experienced extremely rapid growth, things like China and India, and they're basically turned into middle-income countries. Places like sub-Saharan Africa are still extremely poor, and they haven't experienced the growth boom that we've seen in other emerging markets. And those countries are not well situated at all what's to come.
For this. Yeah, no, I know. So before we turn to questions, just a couple things. So, clearly I'm thinking a lot about higher education, my industry and your industry. And, where our students are scattered all around the country and the world, they're learning remotely. I think it's going pretty well, but it's certainly not the way we like to teach our students. And a lot of research is shut down, which is really unfortunate. And, so I've been thinking a lot about what will it take to reopen our sector, and how have you thought about that at all from your vantage point as a professor?
Well, I have. One thing I've been very pleasantly impressed by is the large number of Zoom seminars that I've had access to in the past few weeks, and they've actually been quite effective. I think even like conferences like Brookings, which runs a twice a year macroeconomics conference, they moved to a fully Zoom format, and I thought it was very effective in terms of getting research results. I think classes are less suited for the Zoom format, in part because there's something about the personal interaction in the classroom that's really important. That's hard to replicate via Zoom. People also, it's hard to sit in front of a Zoom for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So I think that's less than perfect. For places like Harvard and Brown, I think the hardest thing is this social interaction among the students. As you go to a place like Harvard or Brown, it's not only to interact with the faculty, which you can partially replicate via Zoom, but it's also to interact with your roommates and your hallmates and clubs and all the things that happen outside the classroom in the evenings, late at night in the dorm when the faculty are asleep, the students are still awake. That's really an important part of sort of the Harvard Brown experience, and that's very hard to replicate via Zoom. And that I feel really bad about. And I think that's why we need to get students back on campus as soon as it's safe.
Yeah. Yeah, the question is when that will be. And I guess that's something that none of us know the answer to, right?
I don't think we know the answer. I mean, it probably depends on things, unknowns like when do they develop a vaccine?
Yeah.
Will it be in the fall? I think it's still a question mark. I'm sure you're thinking about this every day.
Yeah.
I'm still looking at it from the outside. I think it's still a question mark. And it's really up to them, up to the virus and the microbiologists, what happens.
Yeah.
I don't think you can really make a determination until we see what the next few months plays out like.
Right. Do you think that this experience will change the way we do business, though, in the future? I mean, can you imagine Brookings saying, why were we making everybody travel here? We can just do this. Or, will there be some fundamental change in how the economy works?
Well, I have wondered that. I had one of my colleagues who presented a paper at that Brookings say to me afterwards, he said, I thought this was going to be really worse than the normal Brookings panel meeting. He said, I thought it was better. These people were more succinct in their comments.
Yeah.
So his view was actually it was better. I'm not sure it was actually better, but it's true that people tend to be a little more succinct. They less look like they drone on. And if you think people drone on too much, maybe this is better.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more things like conferences go to the Zoom format. I don't think classes will, as I really think there's something very special about the personal interaction you get with the students before and after class as they just kind of hang around and chat with you, as they chat with each other.
Yeah.
I teach a freshman seminar now at Harvard, so it's like 12 students and me who just they sit around in a room and chat about books. And we could do that via Zoom. There are like virtual book clubs, but there's something about having somebody next to you and getting the full sense of their facial expressions and chatting, during the breaks. And that's
well, even when you're teaching, at least my experience, and when you're teaching in a big lecture, you see students' reactions, you see their body language, you can tell if they're understanding what you're saying or not. So even that in-person experience can't really be replicated.
That's right. The one thing I've learned from my publisher, by the way, is that there's been a general trend of the past 5-10 years towards digital books over physical copy books. This is accelerating that. As people are teaching virtual classes, more faculty are experimenting with digital books that they might not have in the past. And some of the faculty may decide, I like this better. And so that might stick. Mm-hmm. And so, physical books might well be a thing of the past at some point.
So overall, just on the economy, I mean, you sound, before we open it to questions, you sound like if we can get the pandemic under control relatively soon, there's a chance that the economy could just open up again relatively quickly. Is that fair?
I think it requires it requires the pandemic to come down. And the forecasts, as I see in the United States, are that it's going to come back come down substantially down by early summer. And then if we can come up with widespread testing so that we can prevent other explosions and we can sort of quickly quarantine the people who are exposed, then I think things could come back.
Yeah.
But I think those are really question marks at this point.
And those are big ifs. Yeah, exactly. But like you say, this is all about the microbiologists, right?
Yes.
And the public health people.
It's been interesting, by the way, to see the economists start getting fascinated by the models of the epidemiologists. The epidemiologists have all these models that we weren't even aware of until a month ago. And economists have looked at these models like, no, these are just differential equations models. So we know how to do that. So
we actually have a small group of one economist and a couple of people in the School of Public Health who are working with the Rhode Island Department of Health on modeling and figuring out what data we need. And it's been pretty effective.
Yes,
and you're right.
Yes, I think there's been a lot of synergies between the fields that probably haven't been explored before.
Yeah, there are. Okay, so look, I hope we have some questions. If people do, they can use the Q&A. I think I see a number loaded up. And Marguerite, I think you were going to read those questions. Is that right?
Yes, thanks, President Paxson. So yes, we have a number of questions. I'll start with this one. Some say that the economic impact of COVID-19 will make the idea of basic minimum income more appealing to the mainstream, even possibly necessary for an economic recovery. Would you speak about this idea, including its potential merits and problems? Oh
yeah, even before the pandemic, I had actually had some positive words about the universal basic income, which I sort of came up in the public debate because of Andrew Yang, who made this a centerpiece of his presidential campaign. And I thought if you wanted to do more income redistribution, something like he proposed, which is a value-added tax using the revenue for universal basic income, made more economic sense than what Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were proposing, which is a wealth tax. And so I've talked about that. The idea of a universal basic income is an old one in economics. You can read about it in Milton Friedman's book, Capitalism and Freedom. He called it the negative income tax, but it's basically the same idea. He wrote that book in 1962 to give you some idea of how old this idea is. In the late 60s, this idea was being debated in Congress, and there was a letter that something like 1,000 economists signed, including famous economists as Paul Samuelson and James Tobin and Marty Feldstein and Peter Diamond. So the idea has been around for a long time that it's gotten a lot of attention over the years. I'm somewhat sympathetic. The general public is generally less sympathetic, and I think one of the reasons is the public tends to think that money should only go to people who have demonstrated need in some way. And universal basic income says that everybody gets $1,000 a month regardless, just because you're an American. Whereas with the programs we have say, well, we'll give you money if you're unemployed, we'll give you money if you're disabled, we'll give you money if you're old, we'll give you money if you're a single mother with 2 children. So we basically want, the programs we have says we want you to demonstrate need of some sort to get money. Whereas the universal basic income approach to social insurance say, look, anybody with low income is going to get money. We're not going to try to distinguish the needy from the not needy. And I'm somewhat sympathetic to that because I think the programs that try to establish need often do so imperfectly. Like, for example, can we really establish if somebody is disabled? Well, something like back pain, well, it's a serious problem for some people. It's very hard to diagnose. So I'm sympathetic to the idea, but it's controversial among economists. And especially among the general public, who really doesn't like the idea of giving cash to able-bodied people who could be working.
Yeah, thank you. So second question.
How does the current situation compare to the 2008 crash? And what are some potential opportunities that Americans can try to seize to help them get back on their feet in the aftermath?
Well, if you look back at the 2008 crash, it was prolonged over a period of time. It wasn't as nearly as quick as this one was. We're going to see a decline in employment in 2 months. That's really, I think, unprecedented. But as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the breakdown of unemployed between permanent job losers and temporary people on temporary layoff, it's almost all temporary layoff. And that's one of the glimmers of hope that maybe this thing will come back quickly. Whereas it was 2008, there were a lot of permanent job losses, and that's just harder to recover from. Having said that, by the way, most recessions are pretty persistent. I mean, I'm hopeful this one will be less persistent than normal, but the typical recession does leave long-lasting scars in the economy. This one looks different to me in some ways. I could be proven wrong. This one looks different to me, that maybe once the pandemic comes under control, we could come back. The one caveat is if it goes on too long, a lot of businesses end up going bankrupt in the process due to liquidity shortfalls, then it could be a much longer recovery.
Yeah, and that's where the policy comes in.
Yes, that's what the policy is trying to sort of help people, saying, well, this thing we hope is short, it's going to be deep. Let's hope you pass this so that we can all sort of, when we leave our houses, we're all pretty much in the same place that we were before this started.
Mm-hmm. Good. Another one?
To follow up on that, you know, you've spoken about this a little bit, but how severe do you think the impact of the pandemic and the resulting crash will be specifically for retirees who must take mandatory distributions from their portfolios?
I think that bill may have included some relaxation of mandatory distribution rules, by the way. I'm not sure about that. Check with your accountant. But obviously, if you're a retiree, your portfolio's gone down a lot in this. Some people might ask, you know, what should we do about this from a personal financial planning standpoint? I tell everybody the same thing, which is always, don't hold so much stock that if it goes down 50% tomorrow, you panic. Because if you're going to panic when it goes down 50%, you probably had too much. You don't have the risk tolerance for that. So, and what I'm doing with myself is, you know, I'm like everybody else. I'm poorer than I was 2 months ago, but I'm not panicking. Sort of pretty much holding constant, knowing it'll eventually recover. And if you're an older person, a retiree, you probably shouldn't have gone into this if you couldn't sort of weather the storm. You probably should have slowly gone into things like bonds and treasury bills and other sort of safer things.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that's interesting is even though we've had this huge decline in the market, we're back to where we were 3 years ago.
Yes.
3 years ago wasn't so bad.
No, that's right. That's right. So yes. So I don't think this should be catastrophic for the economy for that reason. Indeed, at this point, I'm thinking about maybe I should start rebalancing. This whole thing about rebalancing, keeping a certain percentage in stocks. So maybe if you look at your portfolio and say, gosh, I have less stocks as a percentage of the total now than I had, maybe I should rebalance. So keep something in mind. For me, it's like 60% stocks, 40% bonds. So whatever your sort of target asset allocation is, sort of stick to that and don't panic just because things are down now.
Mm-hmm. Do we have time for maybe one or two more questions?
Okay. From an economic perspective, do you see any parallels between this pandemic and the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic?
Yeah, there's been actually some work about the economic impact of 1918. And Robert Barrow, my colleague at Harvard, has a recent paper on that, and he documents pretty sizable declines in GDP from the 1918 pandemic, of roughly the size we're expected to see today based on the forecast. So in some sense, it's very comparable in magnitude. I asked Robert actually, well, what does he think about the recovery? Does 1918 tell much about the recovery? And he doesn't think the data is sufficiently good to give him an answer to that question. So he deferred on that question. The size of the declines seem quite similar to 1918. There's also, by the way, there's also another paper out, I forget the name of the authors, that says that the cities that locked down sooner in 1918 recovered better after it was over. And that's also sort of a piece of evidence that sort of the social distancing we're doing now is the right thing. It's too bad we didn't start 2 or 3 weeks earlier. But we should especially, it's good that we're doing it now. I hope the rest of the states that aren't doing it, do it quickly, and that we do it for as long as the medical experts tell us we need to.
Good. So do we have time for one more question?
Sure, yeah. What is your forecast for interest rates for the next, say, 1 to 2 years as a result of the pandemic as well as the stimulus bill?
Well, I expect that the Fed is going to keep liquidity flowing at pre-launch rates for the near term, and it'll probably continue for a while. There's some discussion in some circles about whether this thing could be inflationary because there's a lot of stimulus put into the system, a lot of monetary expansion. as supply chains get disrupted and people are staying at home not working, there's some contractions in supply. So this expansion in demand and the contraction in supply would tend to be inflationary. On the other hand, lots of people aren't spending either because they can't go out and spend. That's sort of a contraction in demand. So the question is, which of these forces are going to work out? If 2 years from now inflation does perk up, that's not the end of the world, by the way. So that's the least of my concerns compared to widespread unemployment or widespread mortality. But if inflation does pick up, then it's possible the Fed would feel like they need to raise interest rates a few years from now to dampen down inflationary pressures. But as I said, I think if inflation's a risk down a year or two from now, but it's probably not the worst thing that could happen to the economy at this moment.
So I want to thank you for coming and talking with me this morning. It's really interesting. And I wish you the best in the coming weeks as we get through this. And just thanks. Really, really terrific conversation.
So thank you, Chris. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.